I'm excited to kick off a new series today. I'm starting the original, completely never been done before series, book review. Today I'm reviewing The Knowledge Illusion, Why We Never Think Alone by Sloman and Phillip Fernbach. So this book talks about what humans think that they know versus what they really know. It also discusses how we rely on communities of knowledge to perform our day-to-day tasks, with lots of topics branching off of this main tree. So I chose this book to be the first review on this channel because I think it addresses something that I feel is an important concept that I have failed to appreciate at certain points in my life, and I would say that the majority of people that I've encountered seem to miss as well. We think that we understand the world around us much more deeply than we actually do. In The Knowledge Illusion, this claim is supported by experiments in which subjects are asked how well that they think that they understand a certain concept. The subject responds on a numerical scale, and then the subject is asked to explain the said concept. Afterwards, they are asked again how well that they think that they understand the concept. The results of these kinds of experiments show that not only do people overestimate their understanding of concepts relative to their actual understanding, but that asking someone to explain something in depth is a great way to calibrate their perception of their understanding to their actual understanding. That is, that after the subjects explained the concept, they rated their understanding much lower than they initially did before they explained the concept. I intend to discuss several political topics on this channel in the future, so I was particularly interested in an experiment related to this, in which subjects were asked about how intensely they felt about a political policy. Then they were asked to explain causally how the said policy worked. Afterwards, they were asked again to rate their intensity of preference to a particular policy. The results show that people become less polarized when confronted with their own ignorance on how a said policy actually works. An interesting caveat to this style of experiment is that if the reasons for opposing or supporting a policy are identity or value-based, as is the case generally is with the legality of abortion, the respondents would not become less polarized, but if the intended effect of the policy was generally agreed upon, such as healthcare, as in most people want there to be the best care for the most people at the lowest cost, the difference in opinion is largely based on how people get there effectively, or how people think we can get there effectively. In that case, the respondents would become less polarized. The same type of experiment was performed again, except instead of asking for causal explanations of how policies worked, subjects were asked why they supported a policy. The results of this experiment showed that asking why actually made the subjects more polarized. This is certainly congruent with my own personal experience, and in the past this was often the question I would ask friends of whom, in my perspective, held questionable opinions. The experiment shows that if I really wanted them to reconsider their perspectives, I'd be better off asking them to explain from cause to effect how their opinion would bring about some goal. I should mention that people also generally don't like being confronted with their own ignorance, probably myself included, so be aware that asking people to explain things in detail certainly won't win you any friends, and will probably make whoever you're talking to unlikely to want to engage with you in the future. Just some food for thought. The book builds off of findings like these and explains that much of the knowledge that we have is stored within our community, and that we often conflate our access to knowledge to our actual knowledge. The book talks about how we divide our cognitive labor throughout our communities to achieve something that none of us would be able to achieve alone. It's brought up that this reality is in direct contrast to how we attribute progress to individuals in society. We attribute the success of large, complex relationships of communities to individuals. Think civil rights, Martin Luther King, getting to the moon, John F. Kennedy and Buzz Aldrin. Additionally, we tend to oversimplify complex histories with singular stories that don't quite communicate the appropriate nuance of the situation as a whole. We attribute America's involvement in World War II as a direct result of Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, when records show that mere weeks before the attack, public opinion polls showed that the majority of Americans were expecting war with Japan. These stories by themselves might be somewhat harmless, but when these simplified narratives are used to inform the future, they can lead us astray. And this book is definitely not saying that humans' tendency to oversimplify complexity is wholly a bad thing. just that it needs to be taken into consideration. And furthermore, understanding how we store knowledge can make us approach problems more optimally and help us avoid stupid mistakes. Another interesting point made in the book about human cognition in general is one that seems obvious now that I've had time to ponder it. But it wasn't initially intuitive to me at first. We think to act. We don't think for the sake of itself. And this is why when learning is divorced from goals that we care about, it's often ineffective. How many times in school have you thought, why do I have to learn this? Why is this information going to help me later on in life? This is also at least partially explains why practicing math problems is so much more effective than just looking at a bunch of worked out examples. We learn better when action is involved. This leads into the concept of the illusion of comprehension. Quick sidebar, the illusion of comprehension is one of the many cognitive science topics mentioned in the 4-week mini Coursera class, Learning How to Learn, that I highly recommend if you want to know a little bit more about how we learn. Link in the description. Anyway, the illusion of comprehension is pretty much the same thing that I mentioned earlier about our overconfidence and our ability to explain things in depth, just when looked at through the lens of studying. This is why recalling information is a more effective study tool than simply rereading a passage. We mistake our ability to recognize with our ability to recall. Beyond recall, the book brings up the difference between recall and understanding. We can memorize something about something without really understanding it. Understanding requires taking in information much more deeply and deliberately than is common in our day-to-day lives. What I've talked about so far comprises the majority of the book, talking about what we do that might not be optimal. The rest of the book talks more about what we can do about it, and in my opinion, was disappointingly short relative to the rest of the material. So, the book brings up that getting a proper education is just as much about learning as it is learning what you don't know and who to go to when you need to fill in those holes. A common misconception is that we get educated solely to become more intellectually independent, but a large part of it should be learning to collaborate effectively with others, because much more knowledge is stored in the community around you than is in yourself. And the real value is produced through the interaction of individuals within the community to produce something that is greater than the sum of its parts. So let's talk a bit about where to go when you don't know something. The advice the book gives is replicable scientific papers, and I agree with this, but what if you aren't convinced that this is the proper channel to go through? I'll start with a scenario. Imagine that you just got your PhD in chemistry. You want to research an unknown chemical compound that has recently been discovered. Let's say that you want to do some tests on this compound to determine what it is, and that there's an established practice of analyzing the compound in a specific way. There's scientific literature supporting the efficacy of the analysis technique. Do you replicate those papers? What other experts in your field have spent years mastering? Probably not. You probably take it on faith and keep in the back of your mind that those experts might be wrong. This is something that I think most people who are strong advocates of science fail to acknowledge, that is seen as hypocritical from science deniers. Most conclusions in science are based on authority, not direct inference or observation. Now, I want to be clear here. I'm not saying that original research doesn't draw conclusions using the scientific method, but the majority of research out there makes assumptions. And these assumptions are usually informed by previous research. I think that the point that the authors in the book are trying to make is that scientists conduct their research based on faith that others did their research correctly and didn't lie about it. The distinguishing difference between science and religion, though, is that science can be verified through replicable research. The probability of significant falsehoods existing in the scientific community goes down over time as more research is replicated. Typically, if a finding is really important, it garners more attention and becomes less and less likely over time to persist. So, along with understanding that the scientific community relies on people within it to be honest and do good science, an outside observer unfamiliar with the ins and outs of the community needs to understand the scientific method, what cases of scientific fraud have existed, the nature of peer review, what incentives do scientists have to do good science, who's profiting from science. Without a somewhat comprehensive understanding of these subjects, it will be likely difficult to put your own faith in science. if before this video you were initially skeptical of the efficacy of the literature. Along with scientific literature, the authors recommend looking to experts for advice in areas that we don't understand very well. And this certainly isn't revolutionary advice, but how do we know when advice really comes from a true expert? Because due to us being dependent on others for knowledge, we can be vulnerable to those who know this and wish to exploit this feature for financial, political, or personal gain. There's no simple way of determining if someone is likely to tell you the truth, but becoming more scientifically literate, as well as understanding if the person is in a position to potentially profit in some way from you, are good starting points. In regards to making better decisions, the authors believe that the solution is not simply education. The evidence in regards to consumer education initiatives is dismal, showing that such programs have had little effect on consumers' behavior. The author points to Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein's research that it is in fact more effective to nudge people into the desired behaviors by changing the environment rather than actually attempting to change the agents themselves. This kind of thinking is said to be libertarian paternalism. Paternalism because the state takes the role of nudging specific behaviors that it deems good, and libertarian because no one is forcing you to act in said behaviors. An example of this is an opt-out system for organ donors rather than an opt-in system. Along with libertarian paternalism, the authors suggest 4 lessons that should be taken away from their book. Number 1, reduce complexity. We should radically scale back our expectations for how much complexity people can tolerate. Number 2, simple decision rules. Rather than attempting to educate people about a complex system, we should give them rules to follow, such as invest as much as possible into your 401k, save 15% of your income, and get a 15-year mortgage if you're over 50, as well as maybe some correct intuition as to why they should follow the rules. Lesson 3, just-in-time education. If we give people information right before they need it, they are more likely to act on the information rather than forgetting it. An example is advice about the penalties of withdrawing money from a retirement account prematurely when somebody is fired. The 4th and final lesson, and the only one centered on the individual, is that we should check our understanding. We should be aware of our tendency to shy away from explanatory detail and try to at least be aware of our gaps in our knowledge. Hopefully, this will help us avoid intellectual arrogance in making important decisions. Along with the faith that we must have in our communities, it is also important to keep a healthy level of skepticism of whatever it is that we are consuming. And to finish off the summary of the book, I'll leave you with a quote that I particularly enjoyed. Ignorance can be frustrating, but the problem is not ignorance per se. It's the trouble we get into not recognizing it. So that's a pretty detailed summary of the book. If you are hungry for more explanatory depth, you can check out the book. Again, it's The Knowledge Illusion by Stephen Sloman and Phillip Fernbach. My only real critique of the book is that it felt somewhat long-winded for what it was trying to say. I didn't mind this too much as I was particularly interested in the topic. Additionally, it would have been nice to see some more information and/or speculation on how we might potentially remedy the situation. Overall, though, I give this book a 4 out of 5. I'm glad I spent time reading this book and making this video about it. Let me know what you think about my summary in the comments and what you think about the book as a whole if you have read it. Thanks for taking the time to hang out with me and listen to me talk about this book. I just started this channel and released my first video last Monday and hope to continue to release a new video every Monday for the rest of 2019. I'm planning on doing another book review in 4 weeks on a fictional book this time, The Master and the Margarita, and that's going to be much less of a summary and more of a general discussion of the theme and writing style, so stay tuned for that. Also next week, I'm starting the series Based on the Evidence, where I will look at the evidence in regards to the question, is being fat unhealthy? I've already put a lot of work into researching that topic, so I hope that you will watch that video next week. Thanks for watching.